Welcome to How to Interpret Your Bible class. My name is Spencer Conway, and I'm one of the pastors on staff here at Rock Church Halifax. And it's my hope that this would be a resource that would help you in your walk with Jesus and your study of the Bible. So we just wanted to say thank you for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you can stay up to date with all of the new content we're posting every week. But for now, we really hope that you enjoyed this teaching.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode in our How to Interpret Your Bible class. Right now we are in the midst of a mini-series going through wisdom literature. The four books that make up the wisdom literature in the Bible are Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs. So far in part 1 and part 2, we've given an introduction and an overview of all four books and some general things to keep in mind, and we've done a deep dive into how to interpret and apply the book of Proverbs as well as the book of Job. And in today's part 3, it's actually our last class, believe it or not, in this entire series of how to interpret your Bible. We are going to be looking at the book of Ecclesiastes and the book of Song of Songs and the nitty-gritty of how to interpret and apply these books in our lives here and now. So let's jump into it and start talking about the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is perhaps the least straightforward of all books in the wisdom literature. Although I must admit that Job probably comes in a close second behind Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is similar to Job in that the literary context of the entire book must be considered in analyzing any of its smaller parts. It needs to be interpreted as a whole. The book is not a collection of guidelines for living, as Proverbs is. Rather, the book is an intellectual search for meaning in life. Most of the search is futile. The true meaning is not discovered until the end of the book. Therefore, the interpretation of any of the intermediate parts of the book must be understood in light of the entire search and the ultimate answer found at the end. The autobiographical character in Ecclesiastes who embarks on this search is called the teacher or the preacher. Using the tools of wisdom, that is, serious, rational, logical reflection, he attempts to analyze life itself and grasp the meaning of his existence. The book presents observations on life, followed by comments and conclusions. Ecclesiastes is filled with satire and sarcasm. Up until the very end, the tone is very cynical in nature and bordering on bitter. A key word in the book is habel, a word that occurs 38 times. The word is normally used to describe breath, vapor, or mist, things that look as if they have substance, but in reality do not. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 2 sets the cynical tone in the book. The teacher discovers that if one attempts to understand life from a strictly rational approach, the meaning of life becomes like the mist, an illusion of a reality that does not exist. After the opening summary of futility, the teacher begins his quest for meaning. Can purpose of life be found in nature, money, self-indulgence, property, position, intelligence, philosophy, and religious observances? Obviously, some of these pursuits are better than others, but all encounter some crowning frustration that invalidates them as solutions to the problem of living. The world does not contain the key to itself. I think that's a great quote on Ecclesiastes. So let's jump into the specifics of interpretation and application. Step number 1, grasp the text in their town. What does this mean to the original audience? 3 main conclusions emerge from the teacher's search. Number 1, apart from God, life is meaningless. Wisdom is not bad, but it does not provide ultimate meaning in life. Number 2, wisdom does not explain the contradictions of life. It only points them out. Therefore, people should simply put their trust in God. There's the same meaning that we find in Job. And number 3, life, therefore, is not a puzzle to be completely understood, but rather a gift to be enjoyed, similar to the Song of Songs. Most of the proverbs the teacher quotes, the reflections he shares, the observations he makes, or the experiences he discusses point to one of those 3 conclusions. Step number 2. The tendency to search for meaning through sheer intellectual avenues is also common in our day and time. So the river is not particularly wide on this issue. The human need to find meaning in life and our futile attempt to find meaning through wealth, entertainment, work, philosophy, and so on is also fairly universal. So the river is shallow at that point as well. One significant difference does exist, however. The teacher seems to have a limited understanding of death, with almost no concept of an afterlife. We, as Christians, by contrast, live with a confident assurance of the final resurrection of all believers. Likewise, the teacher is concerned with meaning in relation to his life only. As for New Testament believers, we know that meaning for people is tied to the kingdom of Christ and that a significant dimension of this is spiritual, not physical. Also keep in mind that we are under a different covenant. The conclusion of the teacher is to fear God and keep his commandments. This will have slightly different nuances for us who know Jesus Christ and are therefore under the new covenant. Step number 3. Overall, the river is pretty narrow, so most theological principles that can be developed from various texts in Ecclesiastes will be similar to those listed in step number 1. So let's move on to step number 4. That is, consult the biblical map. The New Testament stresses that the relationship with God under the new covenant must center on the life, death, and resurrection of his Son, Jesus Christ. Thus, all life outside of Jesus Christ is futile and meaningless. Therefore, the first conclusion in step 1 above should be modified to read, apart from a relationship with Jesus Christ, life is meaningless. Rational, logical thought is not bad, but it does not provide meaning in life. In contrast to the teacher's cloudy understanding of life after death, the New Testament presents a clear picture of a glorious, victorious afterlife when all the wrongs will be corrected and all suffering will pass away. Therefore, it is imperative that we see the cynicism and bitterness of the teacher as a result of the fruitless part of his search and not as part of the final principles we come away with. There is nothing bitter or cynical about the gospel. Finally, step number 5, which is application. Application will vary somewhat with the situation of each believer who seeks to apply the message. However, most of us need to be constantly reminded that apart from a relationship with Jesus, life is meaningless. The world around us, movies, TV, literature, offers us the illusion that meaning can be found in education, work, wealth, or pleasure. The teacher points out that a close, rational scrutiny of the situation reveals that such a search is meaningless, chasing after the wind. Only a relationship with our Creator gives us meaning. We as believers would do well to focus our lives on this aspect of life in our quest for meaning. All right, let's talk about the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs is one of the most shocking books in the Bible because it speaks openly and joyfully of human sexuality. It could be called the R-rated book because of sexually explicit passages. It is, in essence, a collection of love poems between a young man and a young woman. Unlike the Proverbs, Song of Songs is organized into 3 logical sequential units. The courtship, which is in chapters 1, verse 2 to chapters 3, verse 5. Then number 2, the wedding, which is in chapters 3, verse 6 to chapters 5, verse 1. And the following life of love, which is in chapters 5, verses 2 to chapters 8, verse 14. The church has struggled through the years with how to interpret and apply such an unusual book. Starting from the 3rd century AD and continuing on throughout much of church history, the prevailing approach was to explain it as an allegory. Keep in mind that after the apostolic period and prior to the Reformation, most biblical interpretation was done by unmarried priests and monks. We suspect they had difficulty in relating to the literal aspects of the book. Also, the church frequently used the allegorical method to interpret other Old Testament texts. And because they desired to find Christ in every text, they abandoned literal meanings and literary context and often spiritualized practically all Old Testament passages. And as a result, the man and the woman in Song of Songs became symbolic of Christ in the church. And the book was transformed from a wisdom book about love and marriage into a theological tract on the love of Christ for his bride, the church. This certainly made the book easier to preach on Sunday mornings. Echoes of such an allegorical interpretation are still around, especially in our songs. However, the allegorical method of interpreting Song of Songs breaks down when we read the text closely and pay attention to context. Scholars today are virtually unanimous in rejecting the allegorical interpretation. Christians today also recognize that sexuality in marriage is a big part of life. And if the wisdom literature is to address the major issues of life, we should not be surprised or shocked to see a frank discussion of the joys associated with marital intimacy. Undoubtedly, sexuality in marriage was also an issue when the book was composed. So let's go through the 5-step process of the interpretive journey and discuss interpretation and application of the Song of Songs. Step number 1. Ancient Israel perceived the wonders of human sexuality fulfilled in marital love to be a divine blessing. We don't know for certain the settings in which the book was used by ancient Israel, but we suspect it was read or sung at weddings. Just as the psalmist praised God for the wonders of nature, so the Song of Songs praises God for the wonders of marital intimacy. It is also important to note that the lyrics of the Song of Songs are addressed to the man or the woman in the story and not to God. If we assume this to be part of wisdom and part of the teachings about character and living rightly, we conclude that the book also provided a model for how a husband and his wife were to feel toward one another and how they were to express their feelings. As mentioned above, the wisdom of Proverbs presented a model to ancient Israel of a quiet, thoughtful, somewhat reserved, wise person who acted dignified in the public world. The image changes in the Song of Songs. The wise, righteous person is now seen as madly in love with his or her spouse, spouting out line after line of mushy compliments and praises about the lover's sexuality. Step number 2. Although the authorship of the book is attributed to Solomon, the book itself does not seem to describe any specific historical relationship in his life. We suspect that it was written as a description of an idealized relationship, one to which any young couple in Israel could relate. With the exception of the mention of Solomon's wedding carriage in chapter 3, verses 7 through 10, there is little in the book reflecting the unique status of Solomon that would create a wide area of the interpretive river for us to cross. The joy and irrationality of a couple madly in love has not really changed that much. And trust me, as a guy that's been married for 3 years, I can attest to this. All right. We do encounter trouble in appreciating the imagery that is used. We suspect that our wives would not be too flattered if we told them that their hair looked like a flock of goats descending from Mount Gilead. Yeah, not going to try that one on my wife. She certainly wouldn't like this one. Your nose resembled the Tower of Lebanon looking toward Damascus. Yeah, no. Compliments to the opposite sex are extremely culture specific. We would suggest not transposing the compliments from the Song of Songs literally into the intimate moments of your marriage. Just a little bit of advice there. Yeah. Also, most readers will be struck by how corny or mushy or sentimental language in this book can really be. However, we're not convinced that this is a big difference if the passages are placed in the right context. A Christian couple today, if they are madly and crazily in love, as the one in the Song of Songs, will also say some overly sweet and dopey things to each other when they are alone. Step number 3. Any theological principles must be built on similarities between their situation and ours. One of the main theological points that emerges from many passages in the Song of Songs is that the person seeking to live a wise, godly life should be madly in love with her husband or his wife and should express this love in strong emotional terms. Step number 4. The New Testament does not really modify this principle. In Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 to 33, Paul's advice to husbands and wives correspond well with this main principle. So let's talk about application. Application will vary with the situation of believers. Note the celebration of sexuality in Song of Songs is apparently directed to married couples or those approaching marriage. It is especially appropriate for those who are newly married. We suggest that newly married couples read Song of Songs to each other on their honeymoon. Yet it's corny, but also fun and appropriate. We do not think this book has much application for those who are not married. However, married couples can apply it verbally, expressing their love to their spouses with lots of romantic, sentimental compliments, dopey as they may be to outsiders. We grasp the text as this wisdom book shapes our character, that is, as we become a little bit wild and crazy in our love affair with our marriage partner. We balance our way of life with both Proverbs and Song of Songs. In public, we follow the pattern of quiet, thoughtful, frugal, hardworking, wise people. But when alone with our wives and husbands, we follow the wild, crazy pattern of the two lovers in Song of Songs. This, too, is wisdom. So in conclusion, the wisdom books are extremely applicable to Christians today. Many of the principles flowing out of these books deal with everyday issues that believers struggle with. Don't ignore these books. The wisdom books are rich and deep with practical help for us in our day-to-day life. They will help us to be wise and to develop godly character, a character that is able to make right decisions in life. And that is our final session in our How to Interpret the Bible class. Thank you so much for being a part.